The most dangerous promises are the ones that begin with the words, "It is only pretend." If someone had told me that agreeing to fake a relationship for one quiet family weekend would completely change the way I looked at my best friend, I would have laughed and driven away without another thought. At the time, pretending sounded simple, temporary, safe. Ryan Foster and I had been best friends for nearly 14 years, and there had never been a moment when I questioned what we were. He was the first person I called whenever life became complicated, and I was the person who knew exactly how he took his coffee, which baseball team he refused to cheer for, and why he always carried an extra phone charger in his backpack. That was friendship. At least, that was the story I had always believed. Everything started 3 days before my family reunion. My mother called while I was finishing paperwork at the office, and within 30 seconds, I already knew where the conversation was going. She casually asked whether I was bringing anyone special to the reunion this year. I gave the same answer I had offered for the last several summers. "No, Mom. It is just me." She sighed with loving disappointment before reminding me that my cousins were all married now, several had children, and everyone would inevitably ask why I still arrived alone every year. I promised I would survive the questions like always, but after we ended the call, I found myself staring at my computer without reading a single word on the screen. Later that evening, Ryan stopped by my apartment carrying takeout from our favorite neighborhood restaurant. One look at my face was enough. "Family reunion?" he asked while setting the food on the kitchen counter. "How do you always know?" He smiled. "Because you only make that expression after talking to your mother or paying your taxes." I laughed despite myself before explaining the conversation. Ryan listened quietly while unpacking the food, nodding every few seconds without interrupting. When I finally finished complaining about another weekend filled with awkward questions, he leaned back in his chair with an expression that usually meant he was about to suggest something ridiculous. "I have an idea." I immediately shook my head. "Absolutely not." He laughed. "You do not even know what I was going to say." "I know that face." Ryan folded his arms dramatically. "Fine. Hear me out first." I reluctantly agreed. "What if I came with you?" I blinked. "You have been to reunions before." "Not as your best friend." I frowned. "Then what?" His grin widened. "As your boyfriend." I nearly dropped my fork. "That is the worst idea you have ever had." "Top 5, maybe." "Ryan." He shrugged casually. "Think about it. One weekend. Your family stops asking uncomfortable questions. I get free homemade pie from your grandmother. Everybody wins." I stared at him, waiting for the joke to end. It never did. Instead, Ryan calmly explained that it would only work if we treated it like a simple role. We would arrive together, hold hands when necessary, smile for family photographs, and quietly return to normal life after Sunday afternoon. No unnecessary drama. No emotional complications. Just two best friends helping each other through one exhausting weekend. Against all common sense, the plan slowly began sounding possible. Before leaving that night, we stood beside my front door reviewing our ridiculous rules one final time. "No real feelings," I reminded him. "Obviously," Ryan answered with an easy smile. "No changing the plan halfway through." "Agreed. Everything ends Sunday." "Absolutely." We shook hands like two people signing a business contract instead of creating the biggest mistake either of us had ever made. Neither of us realized that the hardest promises to keep are often the ones made before you understand what your heart is capable of. And before the weekend had even officially begun, Ryan reached over to open my car door for me with such effortless warmth that, for one unexpected second, it no longer felt like either of us was pretending. The drive to my grandparents' house took just under 3 hours, but somehow the conversation between Ryan and me made it feel much shorter. We talked about everything except the plan we had agreed to the night before. Baseball, work, terrible radio songs, and weather. My grandmother would still insist everyone take home enough leftovers to feed an entire neighborhood. Every now and then I caught myself wondering if he was as nervous as I was, but Ryan looked completely relaxed behind the steering wheel. That was one of the things I had always admired about him. No matter how unexpected life became, he had an incredible ability to make everything feel manageable. We turned onto the long country road leading toward my grandparents' farmhouse just as the afternoon sun began stretching across the fields. Dozens of cars already filled the gravel driveway. Children chased each other across the yard while relatives I had not seen in months laughed beneath strings of lights hanging between old oak trees. Before either of us stepped out of the truck, Ryan looked at me with a small smile. Still time to cancel the mission. I laughed quietly. Too late now. He nodded once before reaching across the center console. Then remember the rules. I repeated them automatically. Stay relaxed. Do not overthink. End everything Sunday afternoon. Exactly. Then, before I could open my door, Ryan gently took my hand. Showtime. The simple gesture caught me completely off guard. His hand felt warm, familiar, and strangely natural. We had high-fived after baseball games, pulled each other to our feet during hiking trips, and hugged after difficult moments. But somehow holding hands felt entirely different. I reminded myself that dozens of people would be watching. This was only part of the performance. Nothing more. My mother spotted us before we reached the porch. Her eyes immediately widened before the biggest smile I had seen in years appeared across her face. She hurried toward us, hugged me tightly, then turned to Ryan with obvious delight. You must be Ryan. I have heard about you forever. Ryan smiled warmly. It is really nice to finally meet you. She hugged him without hesitation before linking her arm through mine and leading both of us toward the backyard. Within minutes, we had been introduced to cousins, uncles, aunts, neighbors, and family friends. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Someone welcomed Ryan, asked how long we had been together, and smiled with genuine happiness before moving on to another story or another plate of food. Nobody questioned us. Nobody looked suspicious. In fact, everyone accepted the situation so naturally that I almost forgot we had invented it less than 24 hours earlier. During dinner, my grandmother insisted Ryan sit beside me at the long wooden table. Every time my glass became half empty, Ryan quietly refilled it before I even noticed. When I reached for a serving bowl that was just beyond my arm, he handed it to me without interrupting his conversation. Those little habits were nothing new. He had always taken care of me that way. The only difference was that everyone around us suddenly interpreted those moments differently, and before long, I found myself doing the same. Later that evening, my youngest cousin asked if Ryan wanted to join the family volleyball game. Ryan immediately agreed, even though I knew he had never particularly enjoyed volleyball. He only glanced at me and shrugged. Your family looks like they need another player. Watching him laugh with my cousins, joke with my uncles, and patiently listen to my grandmother explain an old family recipe, I realized he no longer looked like someone pretending to belong. He simply looked like someone who already did. As the sun disappeared behind the trees and everyone gathered for a family photograph, my aunt cheerfully called out, "Ryan, stand closer to Ethan." Before I had time to react, Ryan slipped his arm naturally around my shoulders. The camera flashed, everyone smiled, and for one unexpected heartbeat, neither of us remembered we were supposed to be acting. The next morning arrived with the comfortable chaos that always followed my family's reunions. Someone was already making pancakes before 7 o'clock. My uncles were arguing about the weather as though they had been preparing for that conversation all year. My younger cousins raced across the backyard carrying a football, while my grandmother insisted everyone eat another helping before leaving the table. Ryan seemed to fit into every moment so naturally that I caught myself forgetting he had never met most of these people. Before yesterday, he laughed with my cousins, helped my grandfather repair a loose porch step, and somehow remembered the names of relatives I still occasionally mixed up. Watching him move through my family's home felt strangely familiar, as though he had quietly belonged there much longer than a single weekend. After breakfast, my aunt announced that she had found several old photo albums stored in the attic and insisted everyone gather in the living room. Soon dozens of faded photographs were spread across the coffee table, each one carrying another family story. My cousins laughed at terrible childhood haircuts while my grandmother proudly pointed out every school graduation, birthday celebration, and summer vacation she had carefully documented over the years. Ryan sat beside me on the floor, smiling as he listened to stories he had never heard before. Then my aunt pulled out her phone with an excited expression. "I almost forgot," she said. "I took pictures yesterday too." She connected her phone to the television, and within seconds our family photographs from the reunion filled the screen one after another. The first few showed children playing outside, my grandparents laughing together on the porch, and relatives gathered around the barbecue. Then pictures of Ryan and me began appearing. We stood together serving food, laughing beside the picnic tables, talking with my grandfather beneath the old oak tree, and walking across the yard carrying folding chairs. None of that surprised me. What surprised me was what I had never noticed while living those moments. In nearly every photograph, Ryan was looking at me. Sometimes I was speaking while he listened with a quiet smile. Sometimes I was laughing at something my cousins had said, while Ryan's attention remained completely on me instead of the camera. Even in wide group photographs where dozens of relatives filled the frame, his eyes somehow found me every single time. I leaned forward without realizing it. That is strange. Ryan glanced at the screen. What is? Before I could answer, my cousin Emma laughed. You mean the way he looks at you? I turned toward her. What do you mean? She pointed at another picture where I was reaching for a drink while Ryan watched with an expression so warm it almost made me uncomfortable. That. Several relatives smiled knowingly. My grandmother adjusted her glasses before speaking with complete confidence. Your grandfather still looks at me exactly like that. The room filled with gentle laughter while I stared at the television. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck and looked almost embarrassed for the first time all weekend. I was probably just paying attention. My aunt shook her head with an amused smile. No, sweetheart. Paying attention and looking at someone like they are your favorite place in the world are two very different things. Nobody sounded teasing or judgmental. They spoke with the calm certainty of people simply pointing out something obvious. I looked back at the photographs once more, suddenly seeing them through completely different eyes. Every image captured a moment I remembered, yet somehow the camera had preserved something I had completely missed while living it. As everyone continued laughing over old family memories, I quietly wondered whether the photographs had revealed more than either Ryan or I had ever intended. Because for the first time since this impossible plan began, I found myself asking a question I had never dared to ask before. What if the only person still following the script was me? The afternoon settled into the slow, comfortable rhythm that only a family reunion could create. Some relatives gathered beneath the old oak trees to play cards while others stretched out on lawn chairs with glasses of iced tea, trading stories that somehow became funnier every year. Ryan and I wandered toward the orchard behind my grandparents' farmhouse, partly to escape the growing crowd and partly because neither of us seemed ready to talk about the photographs we had just seen. For several minutes, we simply walked side by side along the narrow dirt path between rows of apple trees. The silence felt different now. It was no longer awkward. It was thoughtful. I finally looked over at Ryan. Did you know you kept looking at me like that? He smiled faintly without meeting my eyes. Looking at? You like what? Like everyone in my family apparently noticed. He let out a quiet laugh. I honestly never thought about it. Before either of us could continue, my Aunt Melissa appeared at the end of the path carrying a small basket of fresh apples. She smiled the moment she saw us together. There you are, she said warmly. Your grandmother sent me to find the two of you because she thinks nobody should wander around hungry. Ryan accepted an apple with a grateful smile while I laughed. She still thinks I forget to eat. She always will, my aunt replied before studying us for a second with the calm confidence only family members seem to possess. Then she said something neither of us expected. You know, the only people pretending this weekend are the two of you. Ryan and I exchanged confused looks almost at the same time. I tried to laugh it off. Pretending about what? She smiled gently. That this is only an act. Neither of us answered. She continued walking beside us at an easy pace. When your mother told me you were bringing your boyfriend, I believed her because it sounded completely natural. Then I met Ryan yesterday, and do you know what surprised me? I shook my head. Nothing. She looked directly at me. There was nothing surprising about the two of you together. You already move through life like partners. One finishes the other person's thoughts. One notices when the other needs a break. One reaches for a drink before the other asks. Those are not things people learn in a weekend. Ryan quietly looked down at the apple in his hand while I struggled to find a response. My aunt laughed softly. I'm not trying to embarrass either of you. I am simply telling you what everyone else sees. She pointed back toward the farmhouse where the rest of the family continued talking and laughing. Do you honestly think your grandparents welcomed Ryan so easily because you introduced him as your boyfriend? I frowned. Is that not why? She shook her head. No. They welcomed him because they have heard stories about him for 14 years. Every holiday, every promotion, every difficult week, every funny disaster somehow included Ryan. By the time he arrived yesterday, he already felt like family. Those words settled quietly inside me as we reached the edge of the orchard. I suddenly remembered dozens of conversations with my parents over the years. Every major memory somehow included Ryan. Every vacation story eventually became our story. Every milestone I celebrated somehow involved him standing beside me. My aunt smiled one last time before heading back toward the house. "Enjoy the rest of your weekend," she said. "Just remember that sometimes people spend so much energy pretending they never notice when the truth has already become obvious." Ryan watched her disappear between the trees before turning toward me with an uncertain smile. "Do you think everyone really sees us that way?" I looked back at the farmhouse where my family laughed together beneath the afternoon sun and realized I no longer knew whether we were pretending for their sake or for our own. Sunday morning arrived much sooner than either of us expected. The farmhouse was already alive with the familiar sounds of people packing coolers, folding lawn chairs, and saying long goodbyes that somehow lasted another hour before anyone actually left. According to the plan Ryan and I had agreed on only a few days earlier, this was supposed to be the end of our performance. We would thank my grandparents, hug my relatives, drive home, and quietly return to being exactly who we had always been. At least, that was what the rules said. As I carried a box of leftovers toward the truck, my grandmother gently stopped me by placing a warm hand on my arm. She smiled with the kind expression that had always made me feel 10 years old again. "Tell your young man to come inside for a minute," she said. I laughed awkwardly. "Grandma," she interrupted me with a knowing smile. "Just humor an old woman." Ryan followed me into the kitchen where my grandmother carefully wrapped an apple pie inside a checkered towel before handing it to him. "This recipe has stayed in our family for almost 60 years, she said. "Now I expect you to make sure Ethan never forgets to eat when work gets too busy." Ryan accepted the pie with genuine gratitude. "I promise." She nodded, with complete confidence, as though that answer had settled something important. When we stepped back outside, my mother hugged Ryan before hugging me. "You two should come for Thanksgiving this year," she said without hesitation. "Everyone would love that." Ryan glanced at me for the briefest second before smiling politely. "We would like that." His answer sounded so natural that nobody questioned it, yet something inside me quietly shifted. We climbed into the truck and waved goodbye as the farmhouse slowly disappeared behind us. For the first 20 minutes of the drive, neither of us spoke very much. The silence was comfortable but unusually thoughtful. Finally, Ryan looked over with a small smile. "Mission accomplished." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. "Apparently." He laughed softly. "Your family definitely believed us." I smiled, but it faded more quickly than I expected. I do not think they were the ones pretending. Ryan turned toward the window, watching the passing fields drift by. "I have been thinking about that too." Another few miles passed before he quietly added, "Do you know what surprised me the most this weekend?" I shook my head. I kept forgetting we were acting. His words landed with surprising weight. I thought back to every ordinary moment we had shared over the past 2 days. Holding hands had eventually stopped feeling unusual. Sitting together at family dinners had become effortless. Walking beside him through the orchard no longer felt like following a script. Somewhere along the way, pretending had quietly become the easiest part of the weekend because it no longer felt like pretending at all. We stopped at a small roadside diner halfway home, something we had done after nearly every road trip since college. The waitress recognized us from previous visits and smiled as she led us to our favorite booth near the window. Without thinking, Ryan ordered my favorite coffee before I even opened the menu. I looked up at him with a quiet smile. "You still remember?" He laughed. "Ethan, I have been ordering that coffee for you for 12 years. The realization made me smile even wider because I suddenly understood that nothing Ryan had done all weekend had actually been new. He had always opened car doors, remembered my coffee, noticed when I skipped meals, and stayed close whenever life became difficult. The only thing that had changed was the way I was finally seeing those moments. As we left the diner, Ryan held the door open for me once again. This time, neither of us joked about the rules anymore. We simply walked out together into the afternoon sunlight, and for reasons I could not yet explain, neither of us seemed eager to return to the version of our lives that had existed before that unforgettable weekend. The days after the reunion quietly settled back into their familiar routines, but neither Ryan nor I could pretend that everything felt exactly the same anymore. We still met every Saturday morning for coffee at the little cafe around the corner from my apartment. We still traded sarcastic text messages during long workdays and argued about baseball scores as though either of us could actually influence the outcome. From the outside, our friendship looked unchanged. The difference existed only in the moments between those ordinary routines, the small pauses where both of us seemed to realize that something unspoken had followed us home from my grandparents' farmhouse. One Thursday evening, Ryan invited me over for dinner, insisting he had perfected my grandmother's apple pie recipe after carefully studying every note she had tucked into the towel around the pie she sent home with us. I laughed when I walked into his apartment and immediately recognized the familiar smell of cinnamon drifting from the kitchen. "I cannot believe you actually tried it," I said. Ryan smiled while setting 2 plates on the table. "Your grandmother told me I had responsibilities now." The sentence was meant as a joke, but neither of us laughed as quickly as we normally would have. Instead, we simply looked at each other before quietly sitting down for dinner. The evening felt surprisingly comfortable. We talked about work deadlines, a neighbor who had somehow locked himself out of his apartment twice in 1 week, and an upcoming charity baseball game our friends wanted us to join. Yet underneath every ordinary conversation lingered the memory of that weekend and the questions neither of us had fully answered. After dinner, we carried 2 mugs of coffee onto Ryan's apartment balcony. The city lights stretched across the skyline while a cool evening breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic below. We stood beside the railing exactly as we had done dozens of times over the years. Finally, Ryan spoke first. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I nodded. "You always can." He looked out across the city before continuing. "Have you ever noticed that every relationship either of us tried never seemed to last very long?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. I always blamed bad timing. Ryan smiled faintly. "So did I." Another quiet moment passed. Then he added, "But after your family reunion, I started wondering if maybe timing was never the problem." I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He took a slow breath as though carefully choosing every word. "Every person I ever dated eventually asked why you were always the first person I called. They wondered why every important plan somehow included you. I always said you were my best friend because that felt like the complete answer." He looked at me with calm honesty. Now I am not sure it ever was. I searched for something to say, but memories arrived instead. Ryan helping me move into my first apartment. Ryan sitting beside me through the longest night after my father's surgery. Ryan driving 3 hours just to surprise me on my birthday when work had kept everyone else away. None of those moments had felt extraordinary while they were happening because they had simply been part of who we were together. Suddenly, they looked very different. I smiled softly. "Do you know what finally confused me?" Ryan raised an eyebrow. "What?" "When the pretending stopped feeling different from our real lives." He laughed quietly because he understood exactly what I meant. Maybe because we were never pretending to care about each other. I nodded. Maybe we only invented the title. The city lights shimmered below us while neither of us rushed to fill the silence. It no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, like standing at the edge of something important without needing to hurry across it. For the first time since that impossible plan began, I realized neither of us was trying to figure out how to return to the friendship we had before. Instead, we were quietly discovering that what we had been searching for might have been growing between us long before either of us had ever called it by its real name. The conversation on Ryan's balcony stayed with me for the rest of the week. I found myself replaying every sentence during my morning commute, every quiet pause during lunch breaks, and every moment before falling asleep. It was not because Ryan had confessed anything dramatic. In fact, neither of us had actually said the words we both seemed to be circling. That somehow made everything even more impossible to ignore. Once you begin seeing the truth differently, it quietly changes every ordinary memory that came before it. The following Saturday, our friends gathered for the annual charity baseball game Ryan had mentioned earlier. It was an event we never missed. Some people came to play while others simply enjoyed spending the afternoon outdoors with food trucks, music, and families spread across picnic blankets beneath the trees. Ryan and I arrived together out of habit, parked in our usual spot, and walked toward the field carrying folding chairs and a cooler filled with drinks. Neither of us questioned why we had naturally made plans together again. It had always happened that way. During warm-ups, Ben, one of our closest friends, walked over with an amused smile. "I have a serious question," he said. Ryan laughed. "That sounds dangerous." Ben folded his arms. Are you two ever going to admit what everyone else already knows? Ryan and I exchanged a quick glance before I answered carefully. We are still figuring that out. Ben nodded as though he had expected exactly that response. Fair enough. Just do not take another 14 years. He smiled and wandered back toward the field, leaving both of us quietly laughing. The game itself was filled with harmless competition, missed catches, terrible swings, and plenty of good-natured teasing. Ryan made everyone laugh after dramatically diving for a ball that landed several feet away from him anyway. I spent most of the afternoon cheering from the dugout whenever our friends managed an unusually good play. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary until a little girl, no older than 7, wandered over carrying a melting ice cream cone. She looked up at Ryan and then at me with complete innocence before asking, "Are you two married?" Ryan almost laughed into his water bottle while I smiled and crouched to her height. "No," I answered gently. She tilted her head in confusion. "Oh, I thought you were because you smile at each other like my parents do." Before either of us could respond, she happily skipped back toward her family as though she had simply asked the most normal question in the world. Ryan remained unusually quiet for the next several minutes. After the game ended, we helped pack away folding tables before walking toward the nearly empty parking lot. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the field while distant laughter slowly faded behind us. Ryan stopped beside the truck and looked at me with an honesty I had never seen before. "I think I need to tell you something." My heart immediately began beating faster, though I could not explain why. He took a slow breath. "Somewhere between pretending at your family reunion and coming home afterward, I stopped thinking about what this was supposed to be. I stayed completely still." He continued quietly. "I kept waiting for everything to go back to normal, but normal never came back. Instead, I realized that every time I imagined my future, you were still standing beside me exactly where you have always been." His voice never shook, yet every word carried unmistakable sincerity. He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "I do not know when it happened, Ethan. I only know that what I feel is no longer something I can honestly call pretending." The world around us seemed unusually quiet as I searched his face, realizing that the one conversation we had both spent weeks avoiding had finally arrived. And for the first time in my life, I understood that the greatest risk was not telling someone how much they meant to you, but waiting too long to say it. For several long seconds, neither Ryan nor I moved. The evening breeze continued drifting across the nearly empty baseball field, while distant laughter echoed from families loading folding chairs into their cars. Everything around us carried on exactly as it had a moment before, yet nothing inside me felt the same. I looked at Ryan, searching for some sign that he regretted what he had just admitted. Instead, I found only quiet honesty. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation that I had to answer immediately. He simply stood there with the calm patience that had always been one of the reasons I trusted him more than anyone else. I finally smiled, though it was smaller than I intended because my emotions felt far too large for words. "Do you know what scares me?" I asked softly. Ryan nodded once. "Probably the same thing that scares me." I laughed quietly. "I am afraid of losing the best friendship I have ever had." He stepped a little closer without rushing the moment. "So am I." I took a slow breath and looked across the empty field where children had been playing only minutes earlier. But I realized something after my family reunion. Ryan waited. I kept trying to figure out when everything changed between us. I smiled at the memory of my grandmother handing him the apple pie, my aunt showing the family photographs, and every conversation that followed. The truth is, I do not think everything changed. I think we finally stopped giving our feelings the wrong name. Ryan's shoulders relaxed with visible relief. He laughed softly and looked toward the sunset. "I was hoping you would say something like that." I shook my head with an amused smile. "You spent 14 years taking care of me without asking for anything in return. You remembered every birthday, every difficult week, every random detail about my life. I kept calling all of that friendship because I did not know what else to call it." Ryan looked back at me. "And now?" I smiled. "Now I think our friendship was always the strongest part of whatever this has been becoming." Neither of us needed dramatic promises. We had already spent more than a decade proving our loyalty through ordinary days. Ryan slowly reached for my hand, giving me every chance to step away if I wanted to. Instead, I met his hand halfway. The gesture felt remarkably familiar because holding his hand had begun as part of our pretend relationship. Yet now there was no audience watching, no family expecting a performance, and no reason to continue acting. It was simply the most honest thing either of us could do. A warm smile spread across Ryan's face. So what happens now? I laughed. Honestly, always. I think we stop pretending. He nodded with complete certainty. I would really like that. The following weekend my mother invited us to Sunday dinner. I almost called to explain everything before we arrived, but Ryan gently suggested we simply be ourselves. When we walked through the front door together, my mother welcomed us with exactly the same warm hug she had given us at the reunion. During dessert, she looked from Ryan to me and smiled knowingly. You look much more relaxed today. I raised an eyebrow. Do we? She laughed softly. Yes. Last weekend you looked like two wonderful people trying very hard not to admit something. Ryan nearly smiled into his coffee while I covered my face with one hand. My father chuckled from across the table. We figured it out before you even arrived at the reunion. I stared at both of them in disbelief. You knew? My mother reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. We knew that whether you called it friendship or something more, the two of you had already chosen each other a long time ago. We were only waiting for you to realize it too. Ryan looked at me with the same warm expression I had seen in every family photograph, and this time, for the first time, I finally understood exactly what everyone else had been seeing all along. 1 year later, my family reunion arrived again, but this time there was no nervous phone call from my mother, no carefully rehearsed story, and certainly no rules taped inside my head reminding me how to act. Ryan and I drove down the same country road toward my grandparents' farmhouse with the windows open in the late summer breeze filling the truck. The scenery had not changed. The old oak trees still lined the driveway. Children still chased each other across the grass. My grandmother still stood on the front porch waiting to hug every person who arrived. Yet everything felt completely different because, for the first time, nothing about us was a performance. As soon as we stepped out of the truck, my youngest cousin ran toward us with a huge smile. You came back, she shouted before grabbing both of our hands and pulling us toward the house. Ryan laughed as he struggled to keep up with her endless energy while I realized how naturally that simple moment fit into our lives now. My grandmother welcomed Ryan exactly the same way she had the year before, wrapping him in a warm hug before placing another homemade apple pie into his hands. I knew you would take good care of him, she said with a gentle smile. Ryan looked at me before answering honestly. That has always been the easiest promise to keep. My grandmother nodded as though she had expected those exact words all along. Throughout the afternoon, relatives wandered from one conversation to another, sharing stories, laughing over old memories, and taking dozens of new family photographs. This time nobody asked how long we had been together or whether our relationship was real, because those questions no longer mattered. Ryan belonged there just as naturally as every member of my family. During lunch, my grandfather quietly sat beside me on the porch swing while everyone else gathered around the barbecue. He watched Ryan helping my younger cousins organize another volleyball game before smiling. Do you know something? I looked toward the yard. What? My grandfather folded his hands thoughtfully. Real love usually does not arrive with fireworks. Most of the time it arrives looking exactly like dependable friendship until one day you finally realize you cannot imagine life without the other person. I smiled because those words perfectly described everything Ryan and I had lived through together. Later that evening, my aunt projected another slideshow of family photographs onto the living room wall. Everyone laughed as picture after picture appeared on the screen, but one image immediately caught my attention. Ryan and I stood beneath the old oak tree exactly where we had posed the year before. The only difference was that this time neither of us had been pretending. My aunt smiled warmly. You know what I love most about these pictures? She asked. I shook my head. Last year everyone could already see how happy you made each other. This year you finally can too. Ryan reached for my hand beneath the table, and I squeezed it gently without looking away from the photographs. There was no audience to convince anymore. No script to remember, and no ending waiting to arrive. Our story had never been about pretending to fall in love. It had been about discovering that the strongest feelings often grow quietly inside the safest friendship until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. As the sun disappeared beyond the fields and another reunion slowly came to an end, Ryan and I walked together toward the truck exactly as we had 1 year earlier. The difference was beautifully simple. Last year we left pretending to be something we thought would disappear on Monday morning. This year we drove home knowing that the role had ended long ago, but the love we accidentally discovered would remain with us for every ordinary day that followed, proving that sometimes the happiest endings begin with two best friends who never realized they had already become each other's forever.